Racist cops torched Big Shaq's documents for fun, laughing like justice was theirs to mock. But what they lit wasn't just paper. It was a fuse. From that fire a storm rose. Calm, precise, unstoppable. Big Shaq didn't come to fight. He came to expose. And when the truth hit, it didn't knock, it shattered. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. In the heart of Stonegrove, a town wrapped in the illusion of peace and the echo of old prejudices, Shaquille Big Shaq O'Neal had become more than just a household name. He was the pulse of a hurting community. His towering figure moved through the streets with a quiet grace, his presence more comforting than commanding. To the children at Oak Ridge Elementary, he was the man who showed up with backpacks every September. To the elders at Riverside Church, he was the one who'd sit beside them after service, listening to stories of marches and scars. And to those who had nothing, he was the one who gave without asking why. Though his bank account was deep, and his fame deeper, Shaq never flaunted his success. The mansion he could have built stood instead as a modest ranch-style home on the town's west end, just a few blocks from where his mother, Lucille, once cleaned offices to make rent. He transformed the abandoned county library into a thriving community center. Free meals at noon, job training in the evenings, and open courts where local kids learned discipline through basketball. What he built wasn't charity, it was restoration. But beneath the smiles and open hands was a constant thrum of unease. Stonegrove had two sides. On one, barbecues, gospel choirs, and open mic nights. On the other, unspoken rules, stairs that lingered too long, and squad cars that drove slower past black homes. The town had never burned crosses, not publicly. It didn't wear its racism in hoods. It wore it in hiring forms, in glares across grocery aisles, in city budgets that somehow always overlooked the west side. Shaq saw it all. He'd seen it since he was a boy, watching his mother be spoken to, like furniture in department stores. And now, decades later, he saw the way young black men were pulled over, just a little more often, how their records were padded with petty offenses. But he also knew how power worked here. The police chief, the mayor, the school board president, all shared a legacy, a handshake too firm, a smile too thin. So he played the long game. He smiled, he built, he waited. Each morning, Shaq walked the perimeter of the community center, a habit formed after too many break-ins during its early days. He'd nod at the early joggers, wave at the old man with the broom who swept the sidewalk more out of pride than duty. Inside, the center buzzed with life. A GED prep class was in session, and the smell of fresh cornbread drifted in from the kitchen, where volunteers prepped lunch. On his desk sat a thick file, handwritten logs of complaints from residents, documented stories of housing discrimination, photos of decaying schools, unsigned contracts, court citations, and notes from families too scared to come forward. This file was no ordinary paperwork. It was a slow-burning torch of quiet justice, one he planned to present during the town hall in 3 weeks. It would expose misallocated funds, illegal property seizures, and corrupt dealings that had stripped the west side of its dignity. He wasn't going to accuse with fists or flames. He was going to dismantle them with facts, calmly, publicly. That afternoon, a young mother, Brielle, came in with her son. They'd been evicted overnight. No notice, no paperwork. Shaq listened as she trembled through her story, his large hands folded in his lap. He didn't interrupt. When she finished, he led her to the resource desk, ensuring she left with groceries, a hotel voucher, and a sense of being heard. Later, he made a note in the log: Brielle Jameson, illegal eviction, possible tie to Officer Daly, cross-reference permit file from April. Outside, the air thickened. Clouds rolled over Stonegrove's sunlit sky, as though sensing what would come. Across town, at a sheriff's office stained by decades of unchecked power, men in uniform chuckled over cigars and planned their next move. Big Shaq had been too visible lately, too loud without raising his voice. They didn't like it, especially not Sheriff Dorn, whose family had run this town with a grip wrapped in badges and silence. Shaq didn't know what they were planning, not yet, but as he locked up that evening, the unease he carried with him daily felt heavier. Something was shifting. And in the silence of that night, as he drove home past the fading murals of forgotten leaders, his heart beat with both calm and fire. The giant was quiet, but the storm was coming. The morning sun poured golden over Stonegrove, softening the edges of a town that too often wore a false smile. Shaq had left early, dressed in a crisp navy suit, heading 2 hours east to speak at a youth reform summit hosted by a state-run education initiative. The invitation had come weeks earlier, and though he wasn't one for speeches, he agreed, because the children mattered. He didn't bring a speech, just his truth. That had always been enough. Back in Stone Grove, the community center carried on as it always did. Breakfast was served, the gym buzzed with activity, and the front desk volunteers laughed over inside jokes. But sometime around 11 a.m., a black SUV pulled up without a sound. It parked deliberately far from the entrance, closer to the rear alley. From it emerged three men in plain uniforms, sunglasses tight over their eyes, with an arrogance worn like armor. Deputies under Sheriff Dorn's command. They'd been waiting for this day. Today they wouldn't knock. Today they wouldn't even pretend. They entered the center from the back. No alarms triggered. They had the override codes. One of them, Officer Brent Kessler, had once overseen municipal security. Another, Deputy Travis Rell, carried a badge passed down from his father like a birthright. The third, a wiry, sour-faced man named Sergeant Hollis Gray, filmed everything on a camcorder he claimed was for documentation. They moved like they owned the place. No words were exchanged, just gestures, nods, the kind of eerie coordination that came from shared ideology. Their target wasn't the food pantry or classrooms. It was the second-floor office, Shaq's office. Inside, stacked meticulously on his desk and shelves, were months, years of work, signed affidavits, housing reports, records of unlawful property seizures, letters from residents too frightened to speak aloud, and most importantly, a locked drawer that held a ledger connecting city funds to private accounts, under Dorn's control. They forced the drawer open with a crowbar. The ledger hit the floor, its pages flipping like a novel of betrayal. Kessler grinned as he lifted it. "You think that's going in the press?" he muttered, almost laughing. In the center of the room, they dumped files into a metal bin, some so thick with evidence that the edges cracked under pressure. Kessler pulled out a lighter, flicked it once, twice, until a flicker caught. The flames were orange and slow at first, curling the paper's edges like it was exhaling. But the heat grew fast, angry, licking the corners of desks, devouring names, numbers, and truths. The room filled with smoke, the kind that clung to clothes and conscience. Gray kept filming, zooming in on the burning documents, like they were artifacts being erased from history. "Say goodbye to your revolution," he said with a chuckle, swinging the camera toward Kessler, who mockingly saluted. The tape would never see a courtroom, but they'd watch it in private, rewinding the moment power reminded truth who still ran this town. By noon they were gone. No alarms, no shattered glass, just the faint odor of smoke, and the quiet hum of an extinguished flame. The staff downstairs hadn't seen them. They'd been kept busy by a fake plumbing issue, another pre-planned distraction. Shaq returned that evening, a little more tired than usual, but uplifted. The summit had gone better than he expected. A few teens had approached him after his talk. One even asked how to start a mentorship program like his in their own neighborhood. That hope clung to him as he walked back into the center, ready to lock up for the night. The moment he stepped into his office, something in him paused. The light wasn't right. The air felt wrong. And then he smelled it: burned wood, scorched paper. His desk was darkened with soot. The cabinet drawer bent outward, like a broken limb. He stepped forward, slowly, his size no match for the sudden weight of realization. His life's work gone. But the strangest thing was the silence. There was no vandalism, no graffiti, no smashed windows. This wasn't a robbery. It was a message. On the floor, among the charred mess, something small caught the light. A single page, half-burned, still bearing the names of 3 families recently evicted from housing, linked to the sheriff's cousin's firm. The fire had missed it by inches. He picked it up, held it like glass. This wasn't just destruction. It was strategy. Shaq didn't yell. He didn't call the police. He didn't even move for several minutes. He stood there, eyes scanning the ashes, mind cataloging what was lost and what still remained. On the wall was a framed photo of his mother, Lucille, standing beside him at the ribbon cutting of the center 5 years earlier. Her smile in that picture didn't shake. It reminded him who this was for. Shaq knelt, his large frame settling into the debris. He sifted through it carefully, pulling pieces of scorched files, corners of notebooks, burnt envelopes with barely legible stamps. He found the melted remains of a thumb drive, and there, under a collapsed shelf, was the backup copy of the community complaint ledger, protected in a heat-resistant case he'd bought on a whim 2 years back. It wasn't everything, but it was enough. As he stood, a strange calmness filled him. The fire hadn't silenced him. It had provoked something deeper, something slower, and more dangerous. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The air inside Shaq's office held the stale bitterness of smoke and silence. The fire was long gone, but its scent lingered like an accusation. Shaq stood in the doorway for a long time, the dim hallway light casting his shadow across what was once a space of purpose and focus. The desk where he'd drafted strategy, the shelves that held testimonies of the unheard, and the cabinets that guarded the pain of an entire community, all of it now rested in charred fragments. But there was no panic in his eyes, no storm behind them, just a slow, heavy recognition. This wasn't random. This was personal. He didn't call anyone. He didn't take pictures. Instead, he stepped into the blackened room and let the weight of it settle on his shoulders. The community center, his mission, had always been a sanctuary, not just for others but for himself. The fact that someone had breached that sacred space, not to steal, but to silence, struck deeper than theft. It was an attack on every promise he had made to the people of Stonegrove. He moved slowly, kneeling near the heap where his filing cabinet had collapsed. He touched the metal, still warm in spots, then began to sift through the debris with deliberate hands. Shaq wasn't looking for salvageable evidence. He was looking for truth, whatever the fire hadn't managed to erase. Paper flaked apart at his touch, some crumbling into nothing, others half intact. He paused when he saw a leather-bound notebook, its edges curled and blackened, but its core still whole. Gently, he opened it. The pages were stained with smoke, but the ink bled through in places, stubbornly refusing to vanish. Names, dozens of them, lined the inside. Single mothers, elderly couples, veterans, children. Each name had a story. He remembered everyone. He remembered Brielle, whose eviction had pushed her and her son to the brink. He remembered Lionel and Regina, whose home was taken after a paperwork error that wasn't really an error. He remembered the quiet tears of Miss Thelma, who hadn't missed a payment in 30 years, but lost her house to a zoning revision. Shaq sat with the notebook open across his lap, the quiet thick around him. These people trusted him with their stories, their pain. They had spoken because he listened. And now someone had tried to erase that trust, not with words or legal notices, but with fire. That alone revealed everything he needed to know about the men behind it. The sheriff's department wouldn't investigate this. That much was obvious. They'd label it an electrical issue or an accident, maybe even blame one of the volunteers. But the burn patterns, the melted lock, the missing files, those details didn't lie. This wasn't negligence, it was intimidation dressed as coincidence. And still Shaq didn't rage. There was no yelling, no shaking fists. That wasn't his way. Fire was loud. But justice, the kind he believed in, moved quieter, slower, like water slipping through cracks, until it broke through concrete. He rose, the notebook in hand, and stepped out of the room. The hallway lights flickered briefly as he passed, casting shadows that danced along the peeling paint. He didn't head home. Instead, he walked to the back of the center, into a locked storage room, where few people ever ventured. It was cluttered with donation boxes, outdated banners, and old equipment, but in one corner sat a reinforced cabinet, discreet and dust-covered. He opened it with a key from around his neck, and placed the notebook inside, next to a second unopened binder labeled pending claims. The backup files weren't as detailed as what he lost, but they held enough, a skeleton of truth that could be rebuilt, and he would rebuild it. Smarter this time, digitized, encrypted, and stored in too many places for any fire to reach. As he closed the cabinet and turned off the light, his eyes adjusted to the darkness. He felt something change, not just in the room, but within himself. A switch flipped. The kind of shift that couldn't be seen, only felt. It wasn't anger. It was resolve. Outside, the night had deepened. The streets were quiet, but tension hung in the air like humidity before a storm. Somewhere in town, the men responsible were probably sleeping easy, convinced they'd sent their message, convinced they'd burned away a threat. But they didn't know Shaq. They didn't know what they'd lit inside him. The ashes didn't lie. They told him exactly what kind of battle he was in. Not the kind fought with fists or protests, but one fought with memory, evidence, and pressure applied at the right places, at the right time. He wouldn't retaliate. He would reveal. And when he did, no flame could cover the truth. The aftermath of the fire simmered beneath the town's surface like heat beneath a cracked road, unseen, but ready to rupture. In the days that followed the break-in, no official word came from the sheriff's office. No investigation. No questions. No interview. The building's damage was dismissed as an unfortunate electrical mishap in a small corner of the local paper, right next to the weekly gardening tips. But whispers had a way of traveling faster than headlines, and in Stone Grove, the silence surrounding Shaq's office fire spoke louder than any front-page coverage ever could. It didn't take long before those whispers reached Ryland Trent. His name alone carried tension wherever it landed. Not because he was dangerous, but because he was relentless. An independent journalist with a knack for showing up where he wasn't wanted, and staying until the truth had no choice but to be seen. Ryland had been expelled from 2 publications for defying editorial orders. He wasn't interested in sanitized stories or networks looking to play nice. He lived in motels, carried an old Nikon, and kept his notes in composition books, stained with coffee and dirt. Stone Grove hadn't been on his map until a message from a former source dropped into his inbox. Big Shaq's place got torched. No cops. No press. Something smells. Ryland arrived the next morning. He found Shaq not at the community center, but sitting outside the basketball courts with a clipboard and a phone, quietly organizing meal deliveries for displaced families. There was no entourage, no press conference, just a man doing the work. That was Ryland's first clue that this story was different. He approached slowly, introducing himself with the kind of wariness journalists developed around men, whose reputations preceded them. Shaq looked him in the eye, sized him up, then nodded toward the bench beside him. They talked. Not long, but long enough for Ryland to understand Shaq wasn't just mourning lost files. He was recalibrating. He didn't need someone to amplify his voice. He needed someone who could dig where he couldn't. Someone who didn't mind getting into the places official cameras weren't allowed. So they made a quiet alliance. No contracts. No public announcements. Just a handshake and a shared goal. The truth. Exposed. Ryland started with the basics. Public records. City council minutes. Budget trails. He combed through years of overlooked documentation, tax reallocations, questionable zoning decisions, court appeals that vanished mid-process. Everything pointed back to one name again and again: Sheriff Cletus Dorn. Dorn was the kind of lawman whose smile never touched his eyes. He wore respect like a mask, and power like a weapon. For over 2 decades, he'd operated with unchecked authority, protected by a network of cronies and a county court system that owed him favors, jobs, and secrets. Underneath his department, there were sealed cases, ghost reports, and a growing list of minorities with police records built on nothing more than wrong place, wrong time. Shaq had always suspected, but now, with Ryland's help, there was something more than suspicion. They discovered that the burned documents weren't random. The fire had specifically targeted records that linked Dorn's relatives to illicit land grabs, properties flipped under shell companies to fund private developments. Some were meant for low-income housing. Others had been promised to families in legal settlements that mysteriously fell through. Ryland's research led him to a city worker named Lindell Price, a retired zoning official whose name kept popping up in old permit approvals. When Ryland approached him at his quiet house on the outskirts of town, Lindell was cautious. But the moment Shaq's name came up, his posture shifted. "That man's the only reason half this town hasn't cracked wide open," Lindell said. He agreed to meet Shaq in person, under the condition that it remained off the books. The meeting happened at night, in the back room of a black-owned diner that shut its doors early. Lindell brought paperwork, original zoning maps, minutes from unrecorded meetings, and copies of applications that had been lost years ago. He laid them on the table like old bone. Shaq listened as Lindell explained how Dorn's department had rerouted public land use for personal gain, using intimidation, forged signatures, and legal loopholes that most residents would never even recognize. It was confirmation. Proof. But it wasn't yet justice. They needed more. They needed to connect Dorn's officers directly to the fire. That's when Ryland proposed checking surveillance networks. Not the public kind, but the private ones. Corner stores, traffic cams, even a drone enthusiast whose footage often accidentally captured more than just sunsets. One of these sources, a local mechanic named Reggie Kane, had cameras on his shop just 2 blocks from the community center. The footage tucked in a forgotten DVR showed the black SUV. It wasn't a clear shot of the men inside, but the license plate was visible, registered to the sheriff's department. No warrant. No explanation. They had them. Not in handcuffs, but on record. Shaq stood over the footage that night, watching it silently. No rage. No speech. Just a breath, deep and even. The fire had taken paper, but it had sparked something else. A movement with roots now deeper than fear. And for the first time, the sheriff's grip on Stonegrove began to loosen. Not because someone shouted back, but because someone watched, listened, and refused to look away. The more Ryland dug, the more Stonegrove began to resemble an archaeological site, each layer of bureaucratic dust hiding bones no one wanted unearthed. He sat most nights surrounded by open boxes, yellowed papers, and black and white photographs that seemed to look back at him with a silent urgency. Decades of systemic erosion lay beneath the surface, a legacy not of forgotten errors but of intentional design. Stonegrove hadn't just turned a blind eye to injustice, it had written it into the margins of its policies. Through late-night coffee-fueled research and whispered interviews, Ryland began piecing together a timeline of racial exploitation that stretched back farther than the town's most polished plex would ever admit. He found records of property transfers that never should have happened. Farms owned by black families for generations, suddenly reclassified as abandoned and auctioned to shell buyers. In one case, a 4-acre plot once home to a black church had been bulldozed for a shopping plaza. No legal challenge had ever reached the courtroom. The landowner, a widowed deacon named Harmon Rhodes, had died days after the bulldozers arrived. His name was never mentioned again. But it didn't stop at land. Court logs were riddled with errors, cases involving black teens whose juvenile records vanished after their charges magically escalated to adult status. Many of those names ended up in private correctional contracts linked to the county contracts quietly championed by Sheriff Dorn and approved without debate. The data pointed to a dark ecosystem, carefully cultivated and guarded by men who understood that paperwork, not protest, was the real battlefield. As Ryland traced the paper trails, Shaq found himself drifting into the past, into memories of his father, Clifford O'Neill. Clifford had been a different kind of giant, leaner, louder, a man who walked with the weight of injustice on his back and refused to bend under it. He'd been part of the civil rights marches in the 60s, once jailed for sitting on the wrong park bench in Tallahassee. Shaq remembered the stories, his father's voice shaking not with fear but with righteous frustration. One particular night came back with striking clarity. Shaq had been 12, lying on the floor watching the news while his father sat nearby, scribbling notes for a local protest. Clifford had leaned over, tapped the pencil against his son's shoulder, and said, "They'll bury the truth if we don't hold the shovel, boy. And they're counting on us being too tired to dig." Shaq hadn't understood the weight of those words back then. But now, years later, as he walked through the neighborhood where black homeowners were being priced out with rising taxes and legal maneuvers, the words echoed louder. Stonegrove hadn't just changed. It had been curated, its power filtered, its access narrowed. The system wasn't broken, it had been built this way. Shaq and Ryland worked in sync, two men shaped by different roads, now walking the same one. While Ryland continued collecting documentation, Shaq returned to those who still remembered. He met with elders who'd once signed protest letters, now buried in city hall basements. He interviewed former city clerks too scared to go public, but willing to whisper what they'd seen in offices with closed doors and shredded memos. One name kept surfacing: Cornelius Trent, Ryland's estranged grandfather, once a prominent judge in the district who'd mysteriously resigned mid-term in the late 90s. Ryland had never spoken much about his family, but the discovery unsettled him. Trent had presided over several cases involving land disputes, many of which ended with black plaintiffs mysteriously losing their claims. The records were vague, verdicts rushed. Ryland didn't want to believe his bloodline had played a part in the rot, but journalism didn't care about comfort. It demanded clarity. Ryland pulled the transcripts. What he found confirmed more than bias. It showed complicity, and with that knowledge, he felt something inside him shift, not into guilt, but resolve. The sins of the past could either chain you or drive you. He chose the latter. Meanwhile, Shaq prepared the community. Quietly. He didn't tell them everything, but he made it clear something was coming. He restructured the center's leadership to protect it legally, rerouted funds to secure digital archives, and contacted lawyers in nearby cities who specialized in civil litigation. It wasn't just about exposing corruption anymore. It was about protecting the truth once it surfaced. Together, they created a map of injustice. Not a metaphorical one. A literal color-coded breakdown of every case, every stolen parcel of land, every vanished court file. It wasn't just data. It was a weapon. A mirror held to Stonegrove's face. As the evidence mounted, a storm began to gather, not in the skies but in the undercurrent of the town's quiet routines. The mayor's office canceled 2 press events without explanation. City Hall's website went offline for maintenance, and most telling of all, Sheriff Dorn stopped showing up in public altogether. They had struck a nerve. The roots were deep. But the soil was starting to loosen. In the back room of the community center, behind a stack of unused monitors and forgotten printer boxes, Devron Keyes hunched over a flickering screen. The 16-year-old had come in to fix a simple networking issue, but curiosity paired with instinct pulled him deeper. A digital maintenance sweep of the center's system had led him to an old backup drive long assumed corrupted. Most files were unreadable, static-filled relics that blinked out as quickly as they loaded. But Devron didn't give up easily. His fingers moved with focused precision, bypassing layers of digital noise until a file labeled only with a date began to play. The footage was grainy, the angle skewed, but what it captured was unmistakable. 3 uniformed men moved inside Shaq's office, with deliberate ease. One of them, Kessler, a face Devron knew from neighborhood traffic stops, laughed as he dropped a thick folder onto the floor. The others followed, tossing more documents into a metal bin already half full. The room was dim, and their movements were quick, but the audio, unfiltered and cruel, made everything crystal clear. "You think Big Shaq's gonna cry over this?" one sneered. "Should have stuck to basketball," another muttered, striking a lighter with a snap. The fire roared to life in the bin. The camera trembled slightly, as if the heat itself recoiled from the act. Smoke filled the room as papers curled and darkened. Centuries of injustice condensed into this single act of arrogance. One officer leaned in close to the flame, whispering, "Let him rebuild this," before turning to the camera and offering a salute dripping with mockery. Devron sat frozen. For a long moment, all he could hear was the faint whir of the cooling fan and the static noise of the paused frame. His stomach churned. The footage was raw, unpolished, real, more powerful than anything Rylan or Shaq had managed to collect so far. This wasn't a breadcrumb, it was the whole loaf. Visual proof of a crime the entire town had tried to forget within days. He copied the file to an encrypted folder, naming it Black Ember, then slid his headphones off and headed straight to Shaq. Shaq was in the kitchen, helping organize food packages for an upcoming delivery round. When Devron pulled him aside, his tone wasn't panicked. It was steady, almost too steady for someone who'd just unearthed a bombshell. He showed Shaq the footage without a word. Shaq watched in silence, his massive frame stiffening slightly, but his face unreadable. His eyes never left the screen, even as the men on it laughed, even as his name was spoken with disdain. When it ended, he closed the laptop gently, stood upright, and looked at Devron. "I want to leak it," Devron said, voice trembling. "This changes everything. They won't be able to lie about it now." Shaq didn't speak immediately. Instead, he walked to the window, arms folded. Outside, children chased each other near the court, unaware of the storm sitting on that hard drive. The video was a sword, but timing could make it a scalpel or a disaster. After a moment, he turned back to Devron. "No," he said simply. Devron stared, confused. "Why not? This is proof. This is justice." "It's fire," Shaq replied quietly. "And fire doesn't just burn the guilty." He wasn't being dismissive. He was being strategic. The sheriff's office would go into full denial mode if the video was leaked prematurely. Worse, it would spark chaos, maybe protests, maybe retaliation, and the people who trusted him, who found refuge in the community center, could be caught in the middle. Shaq saw it clearer than Devron could. This wasn't about revenge. It was about exposure. Carefully measured, unshakable, admissible. Once released, the tape had to land where it could not be ignored, on federal desks in public courtrooms, not just on social media timelines destined to be swallowed by algorithmic outrage and forgotten tomorrow. So they encrypted the footage again. Multiple drives, hidden backups, secure transfers. Rylan was brought in, not to release it, but to verify its authenticity and begin preparing the legal framing. He agreed with Shaq. Timing was everything. This wasn't just evidence, it was leverage. Devron was frustrated, but understood. Even at 16, he knew what it meant to play a long game in a town that only played dirty. That night, he sat in the empty tech room, watching the tape one more time. Not out of obsession, but out of duty. Because in that grainy footage, he didn't just see crooked cops. He saw the length power would go to stay hidden. And more importantly, he saw what it feared, a quiet, calculating resistance. The footage wouldn't remain unseen for long. But when it surfaced, it wouldn't just be a clip. It would be the match that lit the courtroom. Shaq had never been the type to strike without precision. Where others saw chaos as a necessary spark, he saw it as a distraction from justice. The tape was proof, yes, but truth in raw form wasn't enough. It had to be delivered like a blade, sharpened, aimed, and timed. That understanding shaped what came next. The sheriff's men played checkers, quick moves, fast power grabs, loud victories. Shaq was playing in a quiet corner of Stone Grove, far from city council meetings and police radios. Plans began to form. Shaq made his first move by reaching out to Reverend Nola Vance. She wasn't just a preacher, she was fire in heels. For 30 years, Nola had been a force in the pulpit and in the streets, leading voter drives, housing campaigns, and once famously confronting a corrupt alderman in the middle of his own re-election rally. Her voice could break silence like glass. More importantly, she had. When Nola spoke, people, especially those who'd been ignored, listened. Shaq didn't explain everything when they met over sweet tea at her church's rectory. He didn't need to. She'd already heard the whispers, the fire, the silence from City Hall, the tension thickening around Stonegrove like summer humidity before a storm. Nola nodded through his words, then leaned back and said, "Good. Now let's give them something they can't unhear." Her sermons began to shift. Still rooted in scripture, but laced with deliberate phrases, injustice in uniforms, land soaked in quiet theft, smoke not from sin but sabotage. The congregation understood, their murmurs grew, and as she rallied them, Shaq prepared his next piece. Monroe Clay had long since retired from the bench, but his legacy remained carved into Southern legal history like a signature. In the late 80s, he'd presided over a series of landmark cases that dismantled a web of Klan-front property seizures across 3 counties. Known for his steel gaze and iron logic, Monroe had made enemies that carried torches, but none had ever shaken his rulings. He lived now in near solitude, tucked into a modest home, with stacks of law books and classical records playing low in the background. When Shaq visited, Monroe answered the door slowly, peered at him, and without a word, stepped aside to let him in. They hadn't seen each other in over a decade, not since Monroe had quietly donated to the foundation that helped launch the community center. But there had always been respect. Monroe listened as Shaq detailed the fire, the footage, and the depth of corruption uncovered. When he mentioned Sheriff Dorn, Monroe's mouth didn't move, but something in his eyes flinched barely.
"You're about to fight ghosts,"
the old judge said. Some of them still walk around wearing badges. But he agreed to help. Not in the courtroom, but in the strategy room. He reviewed documents, crafted airtight language for future depositions, and taught Rylan how to lace each discovery into a narrative that could withstand political whitewashing. It was subtle warfare, and it was working. Nola mobilized from the pulpit. Monroe fortified the legal side. Rylan shaped the story. And Shaq? He moved between them, the anchor that held it all steady. He kept the center running, the meals served, the gym lights on, so the town never forgot what was at stake. His calm unnerved the corrupt more than any protest could. Then came the forums. They weren't called protests. They were community dialogues, hosted at schools, churches, and libraries. Each one structured, recorded, and intentionally inclusive. No shouting, no signs, just voices. Veterans, mothers, teachers, business owners, telling their stories. Shaq moderated, never raising his voice, but asking questions no one else dared. Why was funding cut to the West Side Park? Why were arrest records spiking in one zip code? Why did 3 Black-owned businesses report property tax audits the same week they spoke at city council? The forums drew crowds, not just the angry or the broken, but the curious. Even some city employees attended in disguise. The movement was spreading, not loud, but dense. Every whisper became a warning, and with each meeting, the mask of Stonegrove's peace began to crack. Sheriff Dorn felt it. His office issued public statements about misinformation, but offered no rebuttals. His deputies grew tense. Patrols became erratic. Behind closed doors, he called emergency meetings, demanded records, tried to find out who was leaking. But it was already too late. The power wasn't leaking. It was shifting. Then came the anonymous tip to Rylan, an untraceable email with a digital folder titled SC Contracts. Inside were scans of property deeds, sheriff office invoices, and communications with a construction firm that had quietly purchased 2 blocks of condemned houses on the black side of town. The name at the bottom of every approval? C. Dorn. Rylan passed the file to Monroe. The judge's eyes narrowed as he flipped through the documents, then gave a short, approving grunt. We have something they'll have to answer for. And just like that, the final piece slid into place. Shaq didn't celebrate. He didn't relax. He only tightened the circle, called a quiet meeting with Nola, Monroe, Rylan, and Devron. Around that table, beneath dim lighting and heavy anticipation, they set the date. The day the tape would be released. The day the documents would be delivered to federal oversight. The day Stone Grove would finally be forced to look at itself. The game was no longer about shouting louder. It was about controlling the board, and Shaq had played every move with purpose. The king wasn't toppled yet, but the walls around him had begun to collapse. Stone Grove had always been a town of 2 narratives, one painted on welcome signs and holiday brochures, the other etched into backroom deals and whispered warnings. But now, those narratives collided. As the truth began to slip from the shadows into the public eye, the town's fabric started to tear at the seams. It wasn't a riot or an explosion. It was more subtle than that, a slow, unmistakable split in conversations, in glances exchanged across coffee shop counters, in the tightened lips of city officials who suddenly found their words weighed down by consequence. The forums, once modest in attendance, became packed. People stood in back aisles, sat on steps, clutched printouts of documents. Rylan had helped verify. Shaq didn't preach, he presented. Facts, timelines, names. His voice steady, his questions sharper. It wasn't emotion that moved the people. It was his control, his refusal to spiral even when confronted with denials from council members who shifted uncomfortably in folding chairs. Some listened, some left, but most stayed. Local media, long apathetic to the west side of town, began to show interest when regional outlets picked up the scent. Headlines shifted from fluffy neighborhood highlights to serious coverage. Stone Grove officials under scrutiny, amid allegations of racial corruption. That was enough to push the conversation into grocery lines and Sunday sermons. But attention brought its own dangers. The sheriff's office, which had gone eerily quiet since the initial leaks, re-emerged, not with answers, but with aggression cloaked in protocol. Patrols near the community center increased. Squad cars loitered outside Shaq's home at odd hours. Lights off. Volunteers began receiving anonymous texts, warnings to back off, reminders of minor infractions from years past, suddenly relevant again. The message was clear: fall in line, or be made an example. Then came the smear campaign. Local rumor mills churned with sudden stories. One claimed Shaq had misused charity funds. Another said the community center was funneling political money through false programs. A third, a more desperate fabrication, suggested a volunteer had found drugs in the supply room. That one almost stuck, especially after a sheriff's deputy showed up with a search warrant 2 days later. But the warrant was vague, the search hasty, and the outcome clean. Still, the stain lingered in some circle. Black residents felt the tension first. Some pulled back, fearful of retaliation. Older neighbors who remembered the town's quieter forms of punishment, jobs lost, homes suddenly audited, urged caution. Let things pass, they said. Don't poke the bear. Their fear wasn't weakness. It was memory. But something had shifted. A silent majority was no longer silent. It wasn't just the poor or the historically marginalized. Teachers, postal workers, small business owners, people who had long kept their heads down, began stepping up. Anonymous donations poured into the center. A retired librarian offered archived town records she'd saved from being shredded years earlier. Even a few city employees, still under oath, quietly passed information to Monroe and Rylan. Marches began, not massive, but steady. Not angry, but insistent. Families walking with signs that didn't demand revenge, only accountability. The town's main street, once reserved for parades and fairs, became a moving line of prayer and presence. Reverend Nola Vance led them, her voice rising over hymns and footsteps. Not against flesh and blood, she would say, quoting scripture, but against the systems that dare to think God stopped watching. White officials reacted with deflection. The mayor called for unity and patience, dodging direct questions. City council sessions were postponed. Sheriff Dorn refused interviews, issuing brief press statements that condemned false narratives designed to sow discord. But behind his office doors, panic had set in. Leaks were coming from within. His own men couldn't be trusted. The town, once docile under his grip, had begun to question everything. And nothing rattled a man like Dorn more than the realization that fear was no longer currency. At the community center, Shaq remained steady. He made no public accusations. He didn't flinch when old colleagues distanced themselves. He focused on the mission: feeding, educating, mentoring. His silence in the face of slander became its own weapon. Where others threw shadows, he stood still, letting the truth draw light to their motives. And yet, the threats became more personal. One morning, Devron's bike was found mangled outside the center. A note stuffed in the frame: "Kids who snoop don't grow old." Another day, the center's kitchen walk-in was vandalized. Power shut off. Food spoiled. Shaq took it all in. Quietly, carefully. Every act was recorded, filed, timed. He wasn't preparing for a reaction. He was preparing for a reckoning. Stonegrove wasn't at war. Not yet. But it was no longer pretending. The line had been drawn. And for the first time in a generation, the people who lived in the shadows of silence were standing in the open shoulder to shoulder, hearts steady, waiting for the next move. The battle was no longer about shouting the truth. It was about trapping the lie. After weeks of strategic silence, Rylan and Shaq were ready to move. The real tape, buried in multiple encrypted copies, remained untouched by the public eye, but a plan had been built around it. Not for exposure, but for extraction. They didn't need to broadcast the full truth yet. They needed to smoke out the desperation of a man who thought he still had control. Rylan had edited a short, blurry version of the original footage. 30 seconds of static flashed images. No faces clearly shown. Just enough audio to suggest corruption, but not enough for an indictment. It wasn't fabricated, but it wasn't the raw file either. A calculated illusion. He released it quietly, under an anonymous handle, embedding it in a blog post titled "Stonegrove's Embers, What Are They Hiding?" Within an hour, the post began circulating. Small at first, shared in neighborhood group chats, local Twitter circles, and closed Facebook communities. By the end of the day, it had been picked up by a mid-level media outlet, known for investigative pieces. Questions began rising. Was this footage legitimate? Who were the men in uniform? Why hadn't the sheriff's office responded to the community center fire? Sheriff Dorn saw the post late that night, while seated in his home office, his second whiskey glass half full, and his phone buzzing with alerts. He watched the grainy footage in silence, his jaw tightening. He couldn't be sure which version had been leaked, and that uncertainty lit a fuse under his carefully controlled facade. His first call was to his deputy commander, asking if there had been any internal leaks. His second call, far more desperate, went to a number saved under the contact name, Cleaner. The call was short. An order, not a conversation. But what Dorn didn't know was that his line had been compromised weeks earlier. Rylan, through a tech-savvy contact in a journalism network, had gained access to a federal tip line tracker. With the help of Monroe Clay, they had flagged Dorn's phone number to be monitored for suspicious activity. The moment he said the words "footage cleanup" and "eliminate the files," it was logged, recorded, and forwarded.
They had him.
At the same time, Devron Keyes was running his own quiet operation. After the attempt to frame the center with planted drugs, he'd become obsessed with proving how deep the rot went. Using login credentials, scraped from an old training laptop left in a donated electronics bin, Devron had gained limited access to the internal police database. A dangerous game, but one he approached with caution and coded layers of anonymity. What he found went beyond anything they'd expected. There were sealed reports that never made it to public records. Black teens arrested for loitering, whose detainment logs showed them held for over 72 hours without contact. Evidence lockers marked misplaced. Surveillance requests approved without warrant codes. Even a document trail showing forfeiture seizures, vehicles, small properties, business assets, where the owners were disproportionately from the black community. The justification column for each entry was often blank. Devron compiled it all into a secure dossier, flagged with date stamps, user access IDs, and screenshots. When he passed it to Rylan, his hands trembled, not out of fear but from the weight of what he'd uncovered. Rylan didn't say much, he just nodded, and immediately began building it into the larger case structure. Monroe had outlined. Meanwhile, the reaction from Dorn's office was spinning. A rushed press release denied misleading footage meant to provoke tension. But the language was shaky. Dorn canceled all public appearances. Internal meetings were held behind closed doors. Officers were reminded to remain loyal. But even among them, doubt was growing. Whispered conversations passed between desks. Text messages that read like lifelines. "You seen the footage? It's him, isn't it? I'm not going down for this." Then came the leak.
Not the tape. Not the archive files. But the phone call. Dorn's own voice. Caught on record, naming a third party to contain digital contamination and neutralize unauthorized copies. It wasn't just damning, it was legal dynamite. Shaq released it through Ryland's blog, paired with court-verified transcripts and a brief from Monroe outlining the implications. By morning, the county office was flooded with calls. Local news went live with headlines that finally named names. Stone Grove wasn't just a town under scrutiny, it was a symbol of how long corruption could fester under charm and tradition. Dorn tried to pivot. He claimed the call was about internal cybersecurity, and that neutralize referred to digital threats. But even the softest local reporters weren't buying it. The scent of panic clung to him in every appearance. When a young journalist asked if he'd ever authorized the destruction of property from the community center, Dorn's carefully controlled face cracked just for a second. But it was enough. Shaq didn't gloat. He didn't host a press conference or post a statement. He simply returned to the center the next morning and resumed stacking canned goods in the pantry. Devron watched him, half smiling. The quiet was louder than celebration. This wasn't the end game. It was the moment, just before the king was forced to move. The trap was never about catching Dorn in public. It was about pushing him to act in fear. And he had. Every call, every scramble, every lie trying to plug holes in a ship that had already started sinking. All Shaq and his allies had to do now was wait for the final breach. ChatGPT said. The air in Stone Grove turned electric, as though the very ground beneath it knew something was coming. Rumors swirled like wind through open windows. Shaq was about to be arrested. False charges, fraud, tampering, obstruction, circulated through anonymous tips and whispered warnings. A few local papers even ran speculative headlines, fueled by unnamed sources close to the sheriff's office. The town, already teetering between denial and reckoning, began to hold its breath. Inside the community center, the tension was palpable. Volunteers came in early, left late, eyes cautious but determined. Devron was glued to his laptop, monitoring everything from encrypted email threads to court docket updates. Shaq, despite the growing pressure, moved as he always had. Slow, deliberate, grounded. But even he knew the next move couldn't come from him. Not this time. Monroe Clay had been waiting for this moment. The old judge, never one for theatrics, made a quiet call to a trusted contact in the Department of Justice. He didn't plead. He didn't protest. He simply submitted a sealed brief, a meticulously constructed legal missile that carried more than allegations. It carried proof. Devron's files were at the heart of it. Time-stamped records of systemic misconduct, internal emails, footage logs, audio recordings, and patterns of behavior that no reasonable office could ignore. Attached was the edited transcript of Sheriff Dorn's wiretapped call. The brief didn't just name a corrupt department, it exposed an infrastructure of abuse that had been allowed to grow unchecked. Monroe followed the brief with a formal letter citing obstruction of justice, conspiracy under color of law, and misuse of federal funding. The language was surgical, precise, impossible to misread. The response came faster than expected. 4 days later, without fanfare or press, 3 black SUVs rolled into the sheriff's parking lot at 7:42 a.m. FBI agents, plain-clothed and silent, entered the building in 2 coordinated teams. They carried sealed warrants and a digital forensics team armed with equipment designed to access even the most secure law enforcement systems. Officers inside the department froze, then scattered. Some demanded clarification. Others tried to delete files, but nothing could be stopped. Not this time. Within hours, desks were emptied. Lockers were inspected. Phones were seized. An agent moved quietly through Dorn's office, collecting hard drives and storage media from drawers that had never been opened without a key. The operation wasn't loud, but it was absolute. Stone Grove watched from behind curtains, from car windows, from the edge of its doubt. The powerful were no longer untouchable. Word spread fast. By noon, local news had broken the story. Federal investigation launched into Stone Grove Sheriff's Department.
Civil rights allegations under review. Reporters camped outside City Hall. Parents pulled their kids from school early. Some cried. Others cheered. For the first time, truth had arrived wearing a badge no one could question. Inside the sheriff's department, pressure fractured the once loyal unit. A young officer named Landon Mercer, quiet, observant, and often overlooked, requested to speak privately with federal agents. What followed was a cascade. Mercer handed over internal memos, secret meeting logs, and detailed accounts of cleanup orders following high-profile arrests of black citizens. His statement cracked the wall wide open. Other officers, sensing the inevitable, followed. Whistleblowers. Not many, but enough. They admitted to falsified reports, coerced statements, and ignored evidence. They confessed what everyone had suspected, but had never been able to prove. And then, Sheriff Dorn went silent. No public statement. No media appearance. No denial. His office door remained closed for 2 days. Blinds drawn. His car untouched. His spokesperson issued a bland release. Pending review, Sheriff Dorn has chosen to cooperate with federal inquiries. But cooperation was never his intention. Silence, it seemed, was the only defense he had left. Back at the community center, Shaq watched it all unfold. Not from behind a podium, but from the gymnasium doors. Kids still played basketball. Lunches were still prepped. The world kept turning, but something deep in the town's rhythm had people who once crossed the street to avoid confrontation now nodded at him. Small gestures, gas station clerks slipping him coffee without charge, a retired officer shaking his hand without a word. Gratitude bloomed where suspicion had lived. The town hadn't healed, not yet, but it had opened its eyes. The turnaround wasn't a victory march. It was the long exhale after a held breath. For the first time, power had to answer to people who never raised their voice, but who never backed down either. The courthouse was older than most buildings in Stone Grove, with red brick walls and arched windows that caught the morning light like stained glass. On the day Shaq walked through its front doors, it wasn't just a building, it was the place where silence would finally be broken, and the weight of buried truths would be forced into the open. The grand jury hearing had been scheduled in haste, but the turnout felt like a moment years in the making. Security was tight. Federal marshals stood at every entrance, and news vans lined the streets outside. Inside, the benches filled quickly, not with the curious, but with the wounded. Neighbors who had lived through the quiet theft of homes, the invisible violence of denied justice, the slow erosion of trust in those sworn to protect. Shaq entered without fanfare. He wore no suit, just a charcoal gray sweater, and the look of a man who knew the importance of stillness. When he took the stand, the room didn't hush. It held its breath. He began not with accusations, but with stories. He spoke of the fire, of walking through ash and finding the names of families he'd promised to protect. He told them how the destruction didn't ignite fury, but a deeper resolve to understand what had been erased and why. His words weren't theatrical. They were even thoughtful, etched with sorrow but never swallowed by it. He didn't point fingers. He painted a picture. A town where some lives mattered less on paper, where records disappeared, but the consequences stayed, where children were pulled from classrooms into cells, and homes were taken with signatures never shown. He shared Brielle's story, Miss Thelma's, and others whose pain had been catalogued, boxed, and buried under years of administrative denial. And then, as if passing the torch, Shaq stepped down. What followed was a chorus of voices that shook the room with their quiet courage. A widow in her 60s testified about her husband's wrongful detainment, how he died waiting for a court date that never came. A veteran once honored for service recounted how his business license was revoked on a technicality after he refused to sell his property to a developer linked to Dorn's office. A young mother described losing custody of her children after being falsely accused of drug possession, charges that never made it to trial but haunted her every application for work. Each voice added to a mosaic of stolen years and bruised dignity. They spoke not to shame, but to reveal. It wasn't vengeance. It was testimony. Monroe Clay sat quietly near the front, his hands clasped, his eyes unmoving. He knew the power of the courtroom better than most, and he recognized the shift as it unfolded. The jury wasn't just listening. They were seeing. When it was time for evidence to be presented, Rylan and Devron's work spoke louder than any statement. Digital exhibits were displayed, internal emails, falsified police logs, maps of reappropriated land, and the now authenticated footage showing the sheriff's deputies burning files and mocking Shaq's name. The room didn't erupt. It imploded in silence. Faces paled. Some wept. And then came the moment that would echo through the county's history. The judge, after reviewing the evidence and hearing the testimonies, issued a formal indictment against Sheriff Cletus Dorn and 4 of his senior officers. Charges ranged from evidence tampering and conspiracy to violate civil rights, to obstruction of justice and abuse of public office. The courtroom didn't cheer. It exhaled. But that wasn't all. The judge, moved not only by the volume of misconduct but by the systemic patterns it revealed, ordered a federal review of all past cases handled under Dorn's jurisdiction, over 2 decades of records, trials and plea deals to be re-examined for racial bias and legal violations. Stonegrove trembled. The announcement didn't bring instant unity. In some parts of town, resentment flared. Defensiveness, denial, a refusal to see the structure beneath the smiles. But the deeper feeling was something else. Relief. A recognition, long buried, that justice had not died. It had simply taken its time finding the right vessel. Outside the courthouse, as reporters clamored for statements and families embraced, Shaq stepped away from the cameras. He didn't speak. He didn't raise his fists or address the crowd. He walked to the edge of the sidewalk, looked up at the courthouse's flag, and stood still. This wasn't victory. This was accountability. And with it came the first crack of healing. Stonegrove looked different in the morning light. The air no longer carried tension, but something unfamiliar, something like possibility. The courthouse hearings had ended, but their echo continued to ripple across every block, every bulletin board. Every silent nod passed between neighbors who'd once looked away from one another. And at the heart of it all stood the community center, rebuilt, repainted, and reborn. Shaq stood at the entrance, where the new mural stretched 3 stories high. It showed a child holding a basketball in one hand, and a book in the other, standing on a path paved with names, not of celebrities, but of families, teachers, and elders who had long been erased from the town's official memory. Above the door hung a new plaque, the O'Neill Center for Truth and Growth. The letters were plain, but the meaning behind them felt infinite. Inside, the smell of fresh paint had been replaced by cornbread and library paper. The gym rang with the soft thud of sneakers. A GAD class was in session. The legal clinic hosted by Monroe's former clerk had a wait list. Everything moved, not perfectly, but purposefully. Behind Shaq's desk, framed in glass and cedar, hung the scorched notebook, its edges blackened, its spine warped, but its name still legible. It no longer symbolized loss. It had become proof of endurance. Ryland's article, titled "What the Fire Couldn't Burn," had gone national within days of publication. It laid out the full arc: systemic corruption, the buried records, the quiet resistance led by a man who refused to shout. Readers from across the country wrote letters, sent donations, and even traveled to see the center in person. The article didn't elevate Shaq to hero status. It made clear he'd never wanted that. It told the truth that real change doesn't come from explosions, but from people who keep showing up. For Devron Keyes, the story had transformed his future. His technical acumen and courage drew the attention of several universities. A full scholarship came through from Howard University, wrapped in a personal note from their digital justice department. "We don't just want you, we need you." When Shaq handed him the acceptance letter, Devron barely spoke, just gripped it like he was holding a new life. Across town, the cracks in the system were no longer ignored. Statues honoring Confederate founders of the town were quietly removed. In their place, the city council approved new landmarks, one to the families who lost their homes unjustly, another to the veterans who testified during the hearings. Streets were renamed, history books in local schools were updated, and while not everyone embraced the change, resistance had lost its grip. The town had tasted truth. It couldn't unlearn it. Shaq rarely spoke publicly. He gave no speeches, held no press conferences, but his presence carried more than words. People followed his actions, the way he helped restack boxes in the pantry, the way he still visited shut-ins who couldn't leave their homes, the way he paused when a teenager looked uncertain and asked, "What now?" In truth, the town hadn't been saved. It had been awakened. Healing, Shaq knew, wasn't a parade or a headline. It was the quiet work that continued long after the spotlight dimmed. It was in the uncomfortable conversations at kitchen tables, the restructuring of policies, the rebuilding of trust. On a mild spring afternoon, as the center hosted its first post-Reconstruction open house, a crowd gathered. Among them were people who'd once doubted him. Some had signed petitions against the forums. Some had believed the rumor. And yet they came not because they'd been proven wrong, but because they'd begun to understand something deeper. That truth is not a threat. It's a mirror. Shaq stood near the edge of the crowd, watching kids race up the steps, their laughter rising above the music coming from the volunteer DJ booth. He didn't wave. He didn't need to. People gravitated toward him not for show, but for steadiness. In a world where noise often drowned out meaning, he remained a symbol of what was possible when someone chose patience over vengeance, strategy over spectacle, love over fear. Stone Grove had been burned. It had been broken. But now it had begun to bloom again, tender, cautious, and aware. And Shaq, quiet as ever, stood not as a man seeking applause, but as something greater, a monument in motion. They thought fire would end the story, but the ash became ink. If this stirred something in you, don't scroll past it. Start conversations that matter. Ask who's writing the rules in your own town. And remember, silence isn't neutral, it's a side.